I just saw 2 deer walking back to my car. Insert pictures. I hope I don't catch tuberculosis. The time is 10:20. I am making the expedition back to my car to go see the statue called the Spirit of Something in Alamo Plaza. I have no idea what it's called. Insert here. So yeah. I'll be there in a bit, I guess. And so I have arrived at where I'm parking. As far as everything else goes for the Alamo, 2 objectives. Get over public embarrassment. B, document our thoughts. Let's go. Mission fucking failed, dude. What I did not realize is the whole thing with the spirit of sacrifice, it's being restored, so there is nothing to see. So I have found what I'm looking for. I made a new plan. I am now going to admire the statues and memorials of Vietnam and Korea. As far as why I didn't stay for more than like 5 minutes is because there were homeless people that were sleeping there and I felt bad, so I was not going to disturb them. So I took a couple pictures. The lighting I found particularly interesting because Vietnam is remembered a lot more than Korea. And if I'm describing this right, there's a light fixture on like the left side of the park, which is from where I was facing. And on the left side was the Vietnam statue, and then in the middle is the like a very tall American flag, and then on the right was the Korea one. So the American flag and the Vietnam statue were lit up. However, the other one, the Korea statue, was not. Which I think is very fitting because most Americans typically, like historically speaking, today, a lot more people are able to tell you about Vietnam, but not as many are able to tell you about Korea. So I think that was a little bit on the nose, even if it was unintentional, the lighting choice. I am a bit more empathetic to the plight of many of the veterans from Vietnam and Korea, for the simple fact of the matter is most of them did not choose to be there. So they wouldn't have gone if they weren't drafted. So I can feel for that. However, when it comes to the more recent wars, like the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan even, I feel a lot less empathy for that, for the simple fact of the matter that there wasn't a draft then. You didn't have to join, and don't get me wrong, there are definitely circumstances in which someone can be, most of the American population believe that Iraq had something to do with the attacks on 9/11, and Osama bin Laden wasn't even in Afghanistan, but the quote-unquote intel that they had, that they fed the American people, were like, okay, let's go to war with Afghanistan because he's there. And they're so I can understand how people's minds can get wrapped up in propaganda to a point where they're willing to join the military. I get it. Propaganda affects everyone. but it's the choice in the matter that is what's separating to me. Like, if you chose to go to Iraq or Afghanistan even, and like injured or died in the war even, it's just like I I want to say I don't care, but that's a little too callous. It's just I don't care as much. So the memorial itself was originally commissioned by two different Vietnam War veterans, and the bronze statues are made by an Austin Duell. That's his name, and he made the two bronze statues of Korea and Vietnam. So that's what they are. As far as my analysis goes on Plato's theory of art, and it kind of has to relate to how the statues are like they're the only types of art that Plato would find useful. And he mentions this in his Republic. Specifically, he says, "But we must know the truth that we can admit no poetry into our city, save only the hymns to the gods and praises of good men." That is the Stephanos number 607a in Plato's Republic. Basically, Plato in that quote is talking about poetry, but I don't think it's that far of a leap to extrapolate that and applying it to like statues per se, because his whole theory of art, it relies on the fact that his theory of forms and our material world isn't technically like real. They're just variations of a form, and so art is just copies of whatever those forms already are. So it's like the fakest of fake you can get. And paintings to Plato are useless, but they're not harmful, while dramatic poetry is both useless and harmful. And he says that mainly due to the emotional like manipulation aspect of dramatic poetry, which is said to be so visceral that it can make some women miscarry. That is what he uses as his example. And basically how the quote mainly relates to the statue for my purposes is the fact that he says he only wants hymns of the gods or good men. And Plato, from what it seems to me from interpreting what he says, he's very much a statist. He is in favor of the status quo of the Roman Empire at the time, which is still very much expanding. It is still colonizing places and expanding its empire. So I don't think he would have a problem with an imperialistic war the United States did. In fact, I think he would be in favor of the statues, which is why I chose that quote specifically to interpret how these political statues, specifically of soldiers, are some of the only like good types of art, he'd say. Because despite the fact that technically the statues are still art and they are the fakest of fake things, because it's imitating something that already isn't real, because it's not the form of that thing. So it's already very fakest to fake. So that, but but Plato's essential thing there is that he's able to ignore the part about it being fake, so as long as it serves what he likes it to, despite the fact that it contradicts what he says about his theory of art of it being useless. But to a certain degree, everybody is cognitively dissonant about something. Plato chooses it to be about this. So the quote that I went with was, "Then he would behold the heavenly bodies in the heaven itself by night, seeing the light of the stars and the moon with greater ease than the sun and its light by day," which is on page 5 of a Sean Ayer translation, I believe. But in this case, I'm not using like the quote that I mentioned as a comparison to Plato's theory of forms. I'm more using it as a comparison
to knowledge and relating how to become an anti-imperialist in the imperial core in the United States specifically, stay with me because this one's going to be a bit longer. Now, when I looked at the memorial earlier in the video, I kept talking about how I found the lighting to be very interesting. And that was the lighting that was cast more towards the left side of the monument, where the statue of Vietnam was, which is a larger statue in general. So the Vietnam statue is pretty much lit up, and then it has the light shining towards the right, and in the middle you have the tall American flag standing there, and it's still lit up. But then you get to the right side of the memorial, which is where the Korean memorial statue is, which is a lot smaller, but it's in the dark. The light doesn't reach it. Now that stuck with me, and I had to really think about this. And so more to the more point that I have is how it relates to how Korea versus Vietnam is remembered, and also how I experienced it. I thought of this quote in the Allegory of the Cave because I went to go see the memorial at night. So that is the more like obvious choice. The moon was out, the stars were out, I could see them. That's like the obvious reason why this quote appealed to me, but the other reason was the lighting choice of the memorial itself and how Korea and Vietnam are remembered. The Vietnam War was a lot longer. If I remember correctly, it spanned from the mid-50s to, I believe, the very early 70s. But then the Korean War, I think, only lasted like 2 or 3 years. So these wars are very different in how long they affected the American public and just how much they affected the American public. Because generally speaking, most Americans do not care about foreign policy. Foreign policy really is not a big issue in domestic politics because we set foreign policy for the rest of the globe, basically, because we are the global hegemon living here in the United States. So it's just not something like the American citizen has to worry about unless like foreign policy becomes that thing of that election cycle, if that makes sense. Like recently speaking, Israel committing a genocide in Palestine, that became the foreign policy issue because it became the issue on the global stage. Now, broadly speaking, America doesn't really have to worry about foreign policy because we are the global hegemon, but on top of that, there is also the degree to which the fighting that is done overseas, it does not touch us in a very concrete and material way. Don't get me wrong, especially with whether it be the wars on terror or you want to say like the war in Korea and Vietnam, we definitely had deaths of our own soldiers. That's to say that's our material impact on those consequences. However, because the fighting is so far away from the domestic front, and because North America is so isolated from the rest of the globe where our conflict has been, it takes longer for Americans to pay attention to a degree in which they care. Like there needs to be a certain number of death toll, and B, it needs to be present, like it needs to be consistently present in the domestic news cycle. So for it to get that to that degree, Americans need to have it within their brains for a while. What I think of when I hear this is the amount of time it takes for Americans to become anti-war because they start seeing the effect of that war. Like they start hearing about the death toll, about the American soldiers dying over there. They start seeing it on domestic news so much to where they're like, why are we doing this anymore? And it is a very retroactive thing. Like war typically is very reactionary. There's usually some like spur of the moment action that comes, and there is an immediate reaction that leads to the spark up of the war itself. And that reactionary element is emotional, and it is why the immediate, like the American Industrial War complex, that immediate reaction to retaliate is there, and it's ever present, and most Americans will go along with it because we're just getting our get back. We are just getting reflexively back. And to me, that is seeing the sun. That is seeing the day. You are feeding into the propaganda that is fed to you by by the news media. Not just the news media, but today social media as well plays a big part in how people consume and get their news. But inherently, so much of that is still slanted to our government and the State Department of our government in a way that makes it hard for people to get out of that and see a reason to not have that like reactionary immediate reaction of, oh, they're going to see why we can't afford healthcare. Like that's a good thing. So there's that. And how I see the night is, to me, how I see, going back to the quote in itself, able to see heavenly bodies, heaven itself, seeing the light of the stars, the moon with greater ease than at day. And seeing the night is seeing the dark side of the war. Finally, is when Americans realize that it is impactful, and like most of the time after war happens, it's not popular afterwards, but it takes that darkness, it takes the death toll, and it takes them seeing it repeatedly over and over again, continuously looking into that dark to understand why it is bad and how to become an anti-imperialist in the imperial core. Like the prisoner climbing out of the cave and trying to unravel this world he is seeing for what it truly is. It's not easy, but it's true, and it takes deprogramming of what he has previously seen. As far as like earlier in the video when I mentioned propaganda, it is trying to overcome not just propaganda we are seeing through news media, but is what we are taught inherently through our like primary school and our secondary school education here in the United States, about how the United States is on the world stage and how we should behave like the world police, and how we should behave like we are able to just do pretty much whatever we'd like without like any sort of reaction to it, because we are the heroes in that story no matter what, despite the fact that that is not really the truth. So that's what spoke to me about the allegory of the cave and this quote in particular, even if it does not specifically relate to the theory of forms. That is what it meant to me when I was looking at the statues and when I was looking back at the videos that I took.